So, I guess hello everybody. We have Rav Yirmiyohu Kaganoff here, and we've been discussing. Well, we were discussing topics in Psak Halacha, and Rav Yirmiyohu Kaganoff has extensive experience in kashrut from managing the VOD of a small community in Buffalo. To working for the OU. Rav Kaganoff writes extensively articles and edits books, and also does speaking tours occasionally. And yeah, so today the question I have is Pruzbolling, which is a term that because I've verbed, which basically means I'm just pulling up my list, that there are some mitzvot or dinim which are effectively I don't want to say not practiced, but they're sort of rendered not practiced. So the big example is a Pruzbol, where you have Doraita, we have Shemitah Ksafim. At the end of 7 years, all the debts are forgiven, or not all of them, but there's certain conditions. And at some point, Chazal realized that this was not good for the financial system, and the financial system is important. And so this concept of a Pruzbol was published. And anyway, so there's that. There's the concept of Heter Iska, which basically relegates some of the prohibitions of charging interest, effectively null in terms of how the financial system works. And then the question I have for the Rav is, just generally, what are we to make of this concept in terms of is this good, is this bad? What are we to make of this? Yeah. So,
okay, thank you, XV. And I'm going to first start with a little commentary or modification of what you said, but then go to it. Okay, so let's clarify the two specific ones we talked about, Pruzbol and Heter Iska. Both of them are very operative. Or Ribis, and the prohibition against collecting debts after 7 years and the prohibition against charging interest, both are extremely operative. Okay, what Pruzbol did was it created a situation whereby the person who loaned out the money, okay, could insist on making sure to collect it after the 7 years are done, which would seemingly violate the whole idea and spirit law, delivery law, of what Pruzbol's about to do. Okay, and right, and so let's start with Pruzbol and Heter Iska. I'm going to, as we come to it, explain it and how it fits in. It's also a very similar situation. Okay, so in these situations, okay, ultimately, let's take the case of Pruzbol. In the ideal situation would have been and should be for everyone to follow, without a Pruzbol, follow the rule as the Torah set it up, which is that at the end of the 7 years, all loans are forgiven, and they're not technically not forgiven, they're non-collectible. That's really what it is. The person still owes the money on a technical basis, but there's no way to enforce him paying it. And that's, like, technically speaking, there's a whole discussion in the Gemara. If he comes to pay, and there was, and he, how he's supposed to offer to pay. You're supposed to tell him that he doesn't. You can't force him to pay, and he's supposed to say, "I want to pay anyway," and then you can accept the payment. So it's not like he doesn't owe it, but it's like you can't have no method of forcing him to pay. All the methods of forcing him, requiring him to pay, have been terminated by the Torah. Okay, that's the concept of this. Now, Chazal say like this. Okay. We deal with the halacha as the Torah deals with halacha as it should be and supposed to be. Okay, in practice, sometimes we end up with circumstances that are not the way we would like them to be, and it's more because people are just simply not holding at the level that we should be as a collective group. Okay, even our finest. Okay, so what we'll end up doing is that we create a bigger halachic problem than we started because people don't keep it. Now, in the case of Pruzbul, the problem was people were very concerned about lending out money and not getting it back. Therefore, as the sixth year, the seventh year started coming about, and people who needed loans for valid reasons, okay, would come, and the wealthier people who could provide them with a loan refused to do so. Now, the halachas of the Torah are that if you have the means with which to lend another Jew money, you have the means, okay, you're required to do so. Okay, the Torah says in Kesef Hal Sami is one of the cases where the word im doesn't mean if but when. When you lend out, because you are required to. The Torah's concept of resources is that I'm given resources because they are a responsibility, and it's been given to me to take care of, to carry out what I'm supposed to do as a Jew, which includes lending it to somebody who doesn't have it, and that's my responsibility. So if the din of the fact that this, what we call Shemitah's Ksafim, that at the end of the 7 years the loan won't be forced collection, leads to the fact that people stop lending money, right? Then we're causing them because of in order to observe, because they're concerned about the observance of one mitzvah, they stop keeping another. That's not good. Okay. Now, a secondary thing is that the people who owe the money, right, as a collective group, those people in the world, I mean, let's divide the world into two groups, borrowers and lenders. Okay, potential borrowers and potential lenders. The potential borrowers, right, are now in a situation where they can't get access to money that they desperately need, and it's in their better interest to dissolve or create a situation where the loan is collectible that they have in order to provide them with the existence of a loan. Now,
right.
No question, this was not the way the system was ideally supposed to be. The Torah did have within its framework the method of doing this. It's not like Hill, who created Pruzbol, did away with the mitzvah of the Torah. He utilized the existing system without going into all the complications of it. There's a statement that people have made which is really terrible. I know someone who made it originally. I presume that they were the first one to say it. They said that where there's a rabbinic will, there's a halachic way. That's terrible. It's not true. It's not true. Okay? What this person was trying to say was that, well, if the rabbis want something to be done, they'll figure out how to do it, and they'll do whatever they can to do it. Well, that might be true, that they'll do whatever they can, but there's a limitation to what they can do. Okay? It's not like there's always going to be a halachic way to resolve anything because there's a rabbinic will. This person meant it as an accusation that certain situations aren't resolved because there's no rabbinic will to do so. And that's not nice. It's not true. It goes against the whole grain of Judaism, the whole spirit of Judaism, and the spirit and reality of Jewish leadership, Torah leadership. So it's a terrible thing for anyone to have said. And it's not true. So it's false. But in this instance, right, work within the halachic system, we see that sticking to our guns and words, sticking to the absolutes of what, right, without allowing for the flexibility the Torah gave us within the system to figure out how to do it, was creating a worse situation. Not because the mitzvah of the Torah was worse, but because mankind's observance of it wasn't so good. And that's, really where the problem lay. So I would answer you in the concept of how'd you call it? You said it a verb called Pruzbolling. Is that the word you used? If I understood you correctly. The Pruzbolling is in order, okay, when we see that people aren't keeping what we're supposed to be doing as a collective group. If enough people are not doing it in a way, or are being tempted not to do it in a way, right, that we need to allow for a new something. Now, Pruzbol is probably the most extreme example, and some little Hitterisk is pretty close second, because Pruzbol goes back to the days of Hillel. It's a long time ago. It's a very substantive person, and there's even discussion subsequently in the Gemara, those who Amoraim, who felt that they were opposed to what Hillel had done. They weren't changing what Hillel had done, They just questioned, that Hill should have done this, and they accepted it. But that's where it comes from. So now, again, the basic rule here is there was a shortcoming in the way we as Jewish people were keeping with the Torah, and therefore, in order to make matters better in terms of people's halachic observance, firstly. Secondly, in terms of the financial markets and the ability of the poor to provide, this Pruzbul was meant to benefit the poor, right? And since Shritas Ksafim, right, was meant to benefit the poor, and we have a problem with that now. Okay, so we needed to install Pruzbul. Hill needed to install Pruzbul, and that was ultimately A, making people keep the mitzvahs better, B, right, having the poor for whom this mitzvah was shared a better system for them. But again, this isn't right. This was because there was a shortcoming of the people, not because there was a problem with the mitzvah. Now, let's take a few other examples, and then we'll see if we can establish a pattern. Okay, and that's, I think, pretty much where you're at. Let's go with the concept of heter iska. Okay, okay. Now, the Torah bans lending money, right, and charging interest for it. Okay, I'm not going to go into the rationale because I think it takes us a little bit off topic here to do so. But there's numerous and excellent rationales presented to explain the mitzvah. Of course, as we always say, rationale for mitzvah are not something that we ever know for certain. It's only a suggestion that we make as an approximate explanation. We call that Taime HaMitzvah, which should be translated not as the reason for a mitzvah, but the taste of the mitzvah, something that we can understand and experience as we're doing a mitzvah. Okay, that's what Taime HaMitzvah is. Okay, so that's number thing. So now, here we have a similar situation, right? People who should have been lending money without charging interest weren't available. Okay, other people needed loans for business purposes, let's say it started with that. It doesn't have to be that exclusively. Couldn't find a method of borrowing the money they needed. Now, it's, I think, a fair statement to make that if somebody can borrow money without paying any interest on it, they're not going to go borrow money and pay interest on it. I think that's a fair statement, right? Anybody who can borrow money without any cost involved isn't going to go ahead and borrow money and pay a cost. So if people are using a heter iska, that shows us that, again, unfortunately, the people who need the loans, right, are not getting them, right? And therefore have to do this. Now, again, the system here was a heter iska is not, a loan with a heter iska is technically not a loan. Okay, it was structured such that it's a business investment. Okay, it takes into consideration the fact, and the halacha is that a heter iska is permitted even in a situation where both parties are using it only to create the equivalent of a loan with interest. That's what the goals of both the borrower and the lender are. It says that that's still looked to create a heter iska. Now, heter iska was built on structures that are part of the loan system and are part of the business system. And a heter iska changes the loan. It's no longer a loan, technically speaking. It's an investment, but it's an investment structured in a way that the borrower is, or the lender is fairly certain that he'll get his money back and that he'll get the amount of income he's expecting from it, even though it's an investment. And technically speaking, when you have an investment, right, the whole point of an investment is that your capital is at risk, right? And he's trying to avoid that. So again, we have this concept of we should not have needed a heter iska in an ideal world. Okay, it became a practice because of the necessity, and you can see that in every instance of heter iska, the necessity there stares you in the face, right? That is its necessity, and therefore we created this system which fits within the halachic framework, but it's not the ideal halachic framework. So again, using your verb of Pruzbolling, okay, what we did was we utilized the systems that the Torah gave us to create something that's really not what should have been and not what should be in the ideal world, and shouldn't be if people were doing 100% everything the right way, right? And that's true, and it's also true. Now, I'm going to go from here to a couple of other cases, and we'll see how it is. Then we'll see if we can broaden this. You had mentioned
Right.
about you had mentioned to me previous to about Yibum. You once mentioned to me the fact that the Torah has a mitzvah that people should, if a brother dies without progeny, so technically speaking, his widow and his brother should marry his widow. That's a mitzvah called Yibum. Okay, and it's no longer practiced. Ashkenazi Jews haven't practiced Yibum for a century, a thousand years. Okay, Sephardic Jews did practice them until fairly recently. To the best of my knowledge, basically no Sephardic community I'm aware of anymore practices Yibum anymore at all. But that's fairly recent in the Sephardic world. But the result of all is, even without that, the Ashkenazi world was doing it for 1,000 years. We stopped doing Yibum. We only do the other procedure called Chalitza, which was
what was the motivation for preferring Chalitza over Yibum?
Okay, so that goes back to a difficult to understand sugya, but the Gemara talks about a dispute in which there's a Tana who says that someone the reason why you're marrying this woman, sister-in-law, is a critical part on some metaphysical level, okay, to whether the mitzvah is being done right. In other words, if the brother-in-law, right, wants to go through with this marriage because his late brother had a very good choice of pretty women when he married her. The Yavama is a very pretty woman, and he's interested in marrying her primarily because she's a pretty woman. That's why he wants to marry her, not because he wants to fulfill the goal of what the Torah tells us, or the mitzvah, or any of the other aspects. So there's an opinion, and that's the opinion we poskin like, that that's sinful. It's not technically sinful, right? But it's on the if that's why he's doing it, we would rather he do chalitza, okay? And in other words, but it's basically saying is everyone was permitted to do yibum, but really the only one who really should be doing yibum is a person who's on an elevated spiritual level, right? Who will do it for the correct reason. And we can't make that assumption anymore. In earlier generations, they could make an assumption that the person doing it would have a proper judgment as to whether he's doing the right reason or the wrong reason. And he would do it if it was the right reason. If it was the wrong reason, he wouldn't do it. He would do chalitza instead. But we're not comfortable with the fact that he's doing it for that reason anymore. We've lost that comfort level, and therefore we insist basically that he do chalitza. Okay, now, again, if you think about it, it's the same pattern. The pattern is, if we were collectively at the level we should be at, right, this would have no purpose, no need. It's only because we're not, right, at that level, right, that we therefore have to go with something that's second best. In this instance, there's a little difference. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering, is there also, I mean, I could imagine that there could be an additional concern of, let's say, one of the two wants to do Yibum, the other one doesn't want to really do Yibum, but they're sort of shamed into it because it's a mitzvah, and maybe the whole family's sort of pushing them into it or something like that. And then maybe
I don't see that in the literature. I don't see that in the literature. It doesn't seem to me that that's in the literature. It seems to be more a factor of, were you doing this? People should know that they should do this for the right reason. In which case, the difference between Yibum and the other two things we talked about previously is the other two, we created a new mechanics. Okay, the mechanics existed. Actually, we created this. We utilized mechanics, and we developed, using existing mechanics. We developed something to be able to create a different approach. Here, the mechanics are there already because the concern was there the whole time.
Yeah, interesting. Right. It's like Chalitza is the original Pruzbolling.
Right. Okay. But that's an example. Now, I'm going to talk about, here's an excellent example, is Heter Mechira as applied to Shemitah observance. is a perfect example of this. And I'm going to talk about it in two other contexts because we have heter mechira as applies to chametz, and we have heter mechira as applied to bechor. Okay, and
right.
gradual development of things where bechor is already recommended by 1,000 years ago. Chametz develops. Ooh, well, we'll talk about it. Let me see it. Okay.
Okay.
So let's start out with the bechor situ, and we'll go through it. As a matter of fact, I want to go to one case even before this.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's the following. There is a mitzvah for a farmer, okay, to set aside or to count his animals that are born every year. 1, 2 lambs are born. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's what they go through his doorway from one pen to another pen, and he has a red marker in his hand, and he marks the 10th one, and he says Kodesh or Siri, and the 10th one is now Meiser Behema and becomes a korban to be offered in the Beis Hamikdash Mizbeach. Okay, now that's mitzvah the Torah to do that. There's no penalty for not doing that, other than not doing the mitzvah. Okay, there's nothing that the animals are holy and he has to do things. If he does that, he's doing the mitzvah. Okay, now way back when it said that we stopped doing this mitzvah, there's no Beis Hamikdash anymore. There's no place to bring the korban. It's evident from at least some opinions that immediately after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, they still did Meiser Behema. But it was at a period shortly thereafter, maybe a generation thereafter or so, that it was established not to do this anymore. In other words, do not perform the mitzvah Meiser Behema anymore. The mitzvah is still on the books, right? And if the person were to do it to be valid, he'd be stuck with these animals that are holy and he can't do anything with them. And that's a problem because having a holy animal roam around is asking for trouble, okay? Violated. So Chazal said, we don't want people doing this mitzvah anymore. Now, again, here you have, the situation changed here. That's what the difference is. The situation changed. We can't bring these animals as a korban. If we can't bring these animals as a korban, we're going to be stuck, and therefore we don't want him to do this mitzvah because, again, doing the mitzvah creates worse problems than not doing the mitzvah. And again, we have the same, very similar, it's a slightly different, it's very similar framework we have. Now, with bechor, okay, so the idea was the firstborn animal, okay, is holy of a shoe.
Wait, time out. So what do farmers in modern Israel do regarding Meiser Behema?
Don't do anything.
They just know heter mechira, they just don't.
Yeah, but the truth is nothing with modern Israel. Meiser Behema could be anywhere. You could have, there were farmers in Germany, for example. There were a lot of farmers, a lot of Jews, and a lot of Jews were extensively in the cattle raising business. It was a very common Jewish business, right? In Bavaria, a very common Jewish business to be in the cattle raising business. Okay? And there are Jewish farmers even outside of Israel. I know Jewish farmers who are not in Israel. I know Jewish cattle raisers, right? In a lot of places. Okay, from cattle raisers, nobody does Meiser Behema. Okay. And now, in other words, we don't say he violated a mitzvah. We say that he observed what Chazal told him, which is don't do this mitzvah because it's going to create a problem if you do it. So don't do this mitzvah. Okay. That's Meiser Behema. Now let's go from one step to the next. The next step was bechor.
Yeah.
Now, there's no Beis Hamikdash. Given we don't like that situation, we're unhappy about it. We hope and pray that our Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt and we have a place to bring korbanos, but it's not within our control at the moment. There is no Beis Hamikdash. Okay, so if you have a firstborn animal when it's born, firstborn male animal of the from its mother, so whether it is a ewe or whether it is a nanny goat or whether it's a cow or a heifer, technically, and it gives birth to its first offspring. The offspring is a male. It has kedushas bechor. It has the sanctity of a korban, and anybody who would use it would be violation, right? And you can't do anything with it until it creates its own blemish, and you can't give it a blemish. That's a prohibition of Torah. You can't even cause it to get a blemish. it has to manage to get itself blemished all by its very self. And since it's never read the textbook on how to become blemished, right, it may not know how to do with blemishing on itself, right? So you have this animal there, and it's a problem. Now, the time of the Gemara, they discussed this problem, what to do. The time of the Gemara, they told people to not do what we do today, and that's a whole literature on it. The Rishonim discuss, which I'm not going to go into, why in the time of the Gemara they told people not to do it, and today we do tell them to do it. And that's literature in the Rishonim about what to do and why and how. But the bottom line is we have a different system, right? The system that we use is that when you have a heifer or a nanny or a ewe and it's pregnant for the first time, so during its gestation period, you go ahead and you sell part of the mother to a non-Jew. Okay, that's called the heter mechira, because the non-Jew is not planning to take the leg of the lamb with him or the leg of the nanny with him. Right, you sell him a leg of the mother. Okay, and if you have a big farm, you just you go through this contract on all of the animals. Right, you sell him all the left legs, let's say, left front legs of all the animals in his flock. And this non-Jew is now the proud possessor of a lot of left legs. Okay? He owns them all. You go through proper transactional system. And the halacha is, it's the dispute, it's annoying, but the way we follow it in halacha, that the non-Jew owns part of the mother. Okay? There is no longer sanctity in the offspring. It precludes that the offspring ever has sanctity. It was only time the offspring has sanctity is it was the firstborn of a mother who is completely owned by a Jew. But if part of it is owned by a non-Jew, there's the mitzvah doesn't take place. Okay, now by doing this, we have now created, just like Pruzbolling or just like heter iska, right? We could almost say we've evaded, right, the mitzvah. We can certainly say we've avoided the mitzvah. Okay? Right. So it's somewhere between avoidance of the mitzvah, which we know by taxes is perfectly fine, and evasion of the mitzvah, which is a violation. So let's call it avoidance. We're doing a korban avoidance. As a matter of fact, that's probably the best word to use for this whole thing. Now that we came to this thing, let's call Pruzbolling, shmitas ksaf avoidance. Okay, and heter iska ribis avoidance, right? And chalitza yibum avoidance, right? And this one is bechor avoidance. Okay, now for close to 1,000 years, we know we've been doing this. This has become standard procedure. Okay, and again, this is different from our other cases because we didn't create the situation. We're not to blame for this one. Okay, the Beis Hamikdash, I guess we are to blame because we sinned and therefore the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. But it's a different level of, it's a more indirect level in that way. So, but it's again, we're avoiding, so we now have a great definition for Pruzbolling. We don't say Pruzbolling anymore. We can call it mitzvah avoidance. Okay, if you prefer the term Pruzbolling, that's fine with me. I'm going to use the word, I think, mitzvah avoidance. Okay, I like that better than saying mitzvah evasion, but mitzvah avoidance. Okay, so we're doing mitzvah avoidance. Okay, now let's take this to chametz. Okay, selling chametz to a non-Jew had been a system that existed back in the time of the Mishnah. You always sell chametz to a non-Jew. Even the idea of selling chametz to a non-Jew that you know he's going to sell back to you after Pesach exists already in the time of the Mishnah. In the Tosefta, it talks about it, about a Jew who has chametz that he's going to need after Pesach, right? And he doesn't want to violate the prohibitions of owning chametz on Pesach, so he sells it to a non-Jew without any conditions involved. The complete and total sale. There's no conditions involved here. And he sells it unconditionally. It's the non-Jews completely, and he knows that the non-Jew is going to be nice to him, right? And after Pesach, is going to sell him back, right, the chametz. And, either that, he'll make it the non-Jews worthwhile practice after Pesach, either this way or some other way, or I'll use him. I'll have him to be a different favor. It'll be worth it for the non-Jew to do such a thing also, but there's no conditions. It's all just general given understandings. Okay, now that system has nothing wrong with it at all. Even though we're not allowed to chametz and Pesach, we're supposed to get rid of our chametz, we're going to be burning and destroying it and eating up and consuming the last of our chametz, and then Friday we're going to burn it all, and etc. But the idea of the idea of selling it to a non-Jew, that's certainly an acceptable method of getting rid of your chametz, right? So there's no real mitzvah avoidance over here taking place at all by selling the chametz to the non-Jew, even when, right, we know that you're only selling it to him because you want him to own it over Pesach, and he knows that he's only doing it because he plans to sell a basket to you, and all of you know that this is simply a means of avoiding the prohibition of owning chametz over Pesach, but there's nothing wrong with doing it this way, right? So in a sense, you can say there's no avoidance here at all because the whole system is perfectly fine, right? And there's no halacha that says that you can't sell them the chametz, right? So there's not even a mitzvah avoidance over here. Now, what did become a big problem was the Shemitah terms. And this goes back in history, okay? Now, apparently there were Sephardim who were the only ones in Eretz Yisrael back in the 1700s and early 1800s who used the system even then. But as far as the new Yishuv goes and the Ashkenazi Rabbanim involved, it goes back to, and you can see between 1882 and 1889, both of those are a long time again, and counter to my children, we don't think, I wasn't around then to tell them about to do it or not. But in 1882, it became a big issue about there were people in Europe who felt that the new Yishuv groups could not observe the mitzvah of Shemitah. And therefore, they went to some of the great Rabbanim in Europe, and they told them, well, let's set up a system in which these people sell their land to a non-Jew, therefore the land is owned by a non-Jew, and therefore we can figure out a way of having the land work during Shemitah, and they won't be without any, those people who depend on the land and on agriculture will not be without any livelihood during Shemitah year because they'll, have the non-Jews working the property or whatever it might be. We'll work it out. We'll work out what to do. Okay, that was the idea. In 1882, this heter came about from Rabbanim in Europe. Rabbanim in Eretz Yisrael were very opposed to it. And the Frum Yishuvim were opposed to it, did not do it, right? But those who were less committed, right, did do it, okay? And that was in 1882, okay? Now, 7 years later, next year, 1889, most of the very same Rabbanim who in 1882 had been opposed to the Heter Mechira turned around and said, we're going to do the Heter Mechira and we're going to approve it.
What changed their minds? Was it 1882?
What changed their mind was the changing of circumstances. In 1882, they felt that of the new farmers coming in, there was a large group that would observe Shemitah, right? And we should encourage that. That's what we want them to do. We want them to complete Shemitah perfectly. And they realized that it just wasn't happening. Okay, that the number of farmers who were willing to keep Shemitah was few and far between. And what the result is that simply people would ignore Shemitah and keep the day as if nothing had happened, which is certainly far worse, right, than using a Mechira. Now, here we go. This is exactly parallel to the cases of Pruzbolling, the cases of Heter Iska, at least it seems to be, right? The ideal would have been for everybody not to do this, not keep Shemitah 100%, not do anything, right? However, the realization was that in the case of the guy who needs the loan, right, is not going to pay money for it if he doesn't have to. And if he's not willing to pay money for it, we know it's because he can't get a loan without interest, right? So that means that the necessity of the Heter Iska is staring us in the face, right? In the case of Pruzbolling, it was pretty much a very similar situation.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the second. Now and the heter mechira was the same story. Okay, and therefore, and then it processed over. I'm not going through all the halachas and the history of it and how it developed and how it changed, et cetera, et cetera. It's not germane to us. I'm just pointing out where the background in terms of how the heter mechira came. Okay, so at this point, we've talked about numerous situations with this, as I don't know if you had any others up your sleeve that you wanted to ask about, but I think we can establish a very clear rule and pattern.
Mm-hmm.
The rule and pattern is none of these situations were meant to be. They're not ideal. Okay? The ideal way of observing them is to do them the way the original letter of the law is. In other words, not to use your term, not to Pruzbolling, okay, to modify your term. Or as I would say it in my terminology, not to perform mitzvah avoidance.
Right.
Okay? Now, what happened was most of the time because people were just not ready to observe the mitzvah to the extent necessary, although some situations also happen, mitzvah avoidance, right, if not done, would have become mitzvah violation.
Right.
We could call it mitzvah evasion, but I think it's worse than that. It's mitzvah violation.
Right.
So mitzvah avoidance was chosen as a method rather than mitzvah violation. Okay?
Yeah.
So, and that's ultimately what we're talking about in all of these cases. We were left with a situation where we're going to have mitzvah violation or Torah violation, and mitzvah avoidance ended up being the preferred road, to mitzvah violation. In other words, and I think that pattern follows us throughout, right? Throughout. Okay, in all of these mitzvahs that we're talking about, and I believe that is definitely the established approach that we have here. That we want to do, we would prefer the mitzvahs be done in the optimal fashion. Okay, we see that we're not going to be able to do mitzvah in the optimal fashion, and we're going to end up with a situation of severe mitzvah violation, and therefore instead we substitute mitzvah avoidance for mitzvah violation. Okay, and I think that is the pattern through the whole slew of things that we have. Okay, there are obviously variants. There are differences among these different cases. Okay, each one, because each mitzvah is somewhat differently and structured differently, etc. But I think that's the general pattern that I think satisfies us for what would happen in all of these things. So
right. So I guess it's the way I'm thinking about it is that it is a sad thing that these constructs are necessary. That not necessary, but that because of a change in people's behavior, the ideal path in terms of Yibum versus Chalitza, and all these issues has sort of changes in terms of the best way forward. And I guess it's unfortunate that it's necessary, but it is fortunate that I feel like it's a positive thing that Chazal and Rabbanim are able to support this sort of flexibility. I feel like that is a positive thing, that.
So
right.
I'm going to simplify what you said, and then I have a mention to that we didn't talk about, which I think is an important case to mention.
Okay, sure.
Okay. Now, I would put this very simply. It is a sad situation. We don't have to say state of affairs. I don't have to say that. Sad situation or sad state of affairs, right, that these are necessary. Okay. But it is true that this is okay. These are all situations where the decision to do mitzvah avoidance was a better choice than having Torah violation.
Right.
Okay? And that Chazal were given this control and the right.
Yeah.
In other words,
right.
influence. And that we know because we know Chazal were given the right to make all sorts of takanas. Okay.
Right.
Some of which are easy to understand or brilliant. I'll just pick an example. One of the most brilliant takanas of Chazal, who am I to say brilliant? I'm not in Chazal, but is muktzah.
Mm-hmm.
Because let me show you what muktzah accomplished. Okay, if you follow through it, muktzah was because people weren't keeping Shabbos properly, so therefore they made it a thing called muktzah. Well, how does making these things that you can't move them affect, that people aren't keeping Shabbos properly? Well, let me show you how it works. Once you have an establishment of muktzah and the rules of muktzah, okay, then every Torah observant Jew is in the back of his mind through Shabbos 24/7 or 24/1, right? That entire 25, whatever it is, that entire Shabbos, he is constantly focused on whether I can move something or not. And he's constantly thinking, can I move that or not? Right? It's constantly on his head. He knows the categories of muktzah. He knows the rules of muktzah. And he's everything that he's supposed to. I'm looking at my computer and I would think about, well, my mouse, well, that's going to be something that I'm not allowed to move on Shabbos, but maybe I'm allowed to move it from a como. Maybe I'm not, right? Probably yes, right? And my coffee mug is no problem whatsoever. And my whatever else it is, I'm constantly focused on it. Now, what that essentially does is that you can never forget it's Shabbos.
Right. Interesting.
Your mind is constantly focused in the back burner of your head, right? You're never letting Shabbos out of your head. Now, it's hard for me to imagine any other way of making a takana, right? Now, as I told you, keep focused on Shabbos all the time. Well, we know what we have a mitzvah to be focused on God all the time, and be focused on his oneness all the time, and be focused on loving him all the time, and be focused on being in awe of him all the time. We all know that's there, but, it's not in our it's, muktzah creates a better awareness of Shabbos, right, than anything else would do, right?
Yeah.
Constant. And now, what's the result of that? You can't forget it's Shabbos, right? If you can't forget it's Shabbos and you're take Shabbos with some seriousness, right, then all these other things are, oh, how can I do that? Shabbos, I can't do that, right? That's what they do. So it's a breeze, I'm pointing, this is just Chazal's brilliance, right, at making a takana, right, that accomplishes everything it's supposed to do because of the brilliance in which they did it. Now, that's Chazal's system, okay? They created takanas to make sure that people did what the Torah tells us to do. Okay, now, in our instances here, there are exceptions to the rule only because Chazal ended up with a takana that involves an element of mitzvah avoidance in order to make people sure that people didn't violate the Torah. But it's not dissimilar, right, from the basic rules of takana. Now, you're right. You'll tell me that heter mechira or heter iska or the practice of not to, are not things that go back to the time of the sages, right? But it's the same concept, right? In other words, when the Rishonim developed the concept of heter iska, and then the early Achronim, and even the later Achronim, they developed more and more the concepts of heter iska, use applications of cases.
Right.
Underlying all of that is their authority as Gedolim and Misakne Chazaka for the people. For the people.
Well, there's something interesting and a little different is that there's, sometimes we see like in instances where with muktzah, where people are having trouble with observance and we create a chumrah, like a geder, to basically be more machmir, so people should be more aware. And these examples are examples of basically kulas, that because people are having trouble with their observance, instead of creating a chumrah, we're going to create a kula. And I suppose that, Chazal are going to see which one is ultimately, most effective. It could be with heter iska, chumrah wouldn't work.
Number one, most effective, right? And number two, what's available with the halachic framework.
Right.
Remember, it's not true that because there's a rabbinic way, there's a halachic. Rabbinic will, there's a halachic way. Right. They have the rabbis have to work within the framework that the Torah gave us, and the framework the Torah gave us may allow for certain things and not for others, right? So, so that is a part of how we do it. Sometimes it might be easier to do. The Torah told us chalitza, so why we don't have to create a new world. We have chalitza. The only question is, when do you recommend chalitza? You recommend yibum, right?
Mhm.
In the times of Chazal, they also had it. They did yibum, and at times they said we're going to recommend chalitza because the yavam is so much older than the yavama that we have difficulty imagining that he's going to keep her. How should we say this delicately? Her her physical needs satisfied, right? And it's much easier if the couple are in the same age range for him to keep that part of her life satisfied. Okay, so Chazal, they said that they would go and they would discuss it and they would advise, right, before whether you should be going to chalitza, right? And that's also so we see that they had that in their days. This concept of we have to choose which one, and we just decided now the best one is just to choose chalitza all the time
Mhm.
because we just don't think that we have people here that are ready for Yibum, right? And we don't want to get involved with it. Okay.
Yeah, interesting.
Now I'll show you with you another situation where there's the situation of soldiers who are married and missing in action.
Right.
Okay. That's an old problem, right?
Yeah.
And we know that in the days of David HaMelech, they followed a practice.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, they followed a practice which was that each one of them on his own, right, went to a bezdin and gave his wife a get with a t'nai, that if he didn't return back within a certain amount of time, she could be divorced and not stuck as being an aguna. Okay.
Right.
People have asked the question, well, why don't we do that today? The answer is they never made it as a takana. And
Right.
there's a very good reason why they didn't make it as a takana. It was always quietly done because you've destroyed the whole concept of a marriage once you do this in public.
Wait, how
Right?
so?
Every guy who's going to the army gives his wife a get, and everybody knows about it.
Right.
So they'll come back, they'll swap wives, or the women, while the guys are in the army, will go find somebody else. You've
Oh, I
defeated,
see. Okay.
right?
Well,
It
but it's
was.
only on condition that he doesn't come back. So if he comes
I
back,
understand. Whatever, right? But it was always done. It was never done as a. There was no such takana ever made.
right.
It was only that it was understood, right? This is what people did.
I
And
mean,
if someone were to go to a bezdin because he's going into war, and today, and he would tell the bezdin, like, I would like you to do this, get for me on this condition. Nobody's supposed to know about it, right?
oh,
Nobody else should find out about
interesting.
it, right? Nobody outside my wife should find out about it, and the bezdin. I would assume
Okay.
that they would do it. But once you make noise about it, right, then you're creating a problem. So the people who are making noise about this are the ones who are causing the harm. They think they're
Right.
helping,
Right.
they're hurting, they're harming,
Well,
right?
I mean, I guess what you're pointing out is that there's a trade-off between maintaining the sanctity of kiddushin and marriage
Mm-hmm.
and maintaining the flexibility of divorce. And it's not
It's not.
obvious that we want to
It's not the
maximize the right.
yeah. It's not flexibility of divorce.
I mean,
It's
okay,
you
yeah,
want to avoid a situation of an aguna, right?
right,
Because her husband is MIA, right?
right,
And so I'm just pointing out that nobody ever valued that as a trade-off or the sanctity of a marriage as
right.
such. It was only something that we allowed, and people did it, but everybody did it discreetly. It was a basic thing of nobody said anything about it. Nobody even knew. Like your unit and your army of all your everybody may have done it, and not anybody else knew about it.
I
Nobody
mean,
discussed it.
would that
I'm
be
gonna
the
have to.
same thing? Oh,
I'm gonna have
you
to
have
come
to
to a
go?
close very soon. Yes, very right.
Okay,
Um, anyway, but I just wanted to point that out. That's
okay,
something I've heard people point out, and they said, no, 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 you misunderstood what was done, why, and how, and you are doing the disservice by making noise about it.
right. That's interesting. I mean, also
So
that like it seems like Pruzboll wasn't published before Hill came along and published it. So it could be the
right.
sort of thing that maybe some people did it, but Hill decided that given the situation, it was actually better to publish it. And it could
Mm-hmm.
be that decision is one that Rabbanim and the leadership are going to decide whether this is in net good for the Kehillah or not. But it's not obvious that it is. I mean, before Shmai and Avtalion didn't do it. So,
and it probably Shmai and Avtalion didn't do it because it wasn't necessary.
Right. Yeah.
That doesn't mean that everybody was gold. It means that there were plenty of individuals who probably could have used this as a thing, but the poor people could still find where to borrow money from.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And then it got to a point where A, the poor people couldn't find anybody to borrow from, and B, so many people were going to be in violation of this, right, that it wasn't worth it anymore.
Yeah.
Think of 1882, Heter Mechira of Shemitah in 1889. Right. Now,
Heter
Mechira has gone through many transitions since that point in all directions, up, down, right?
Yeah.
And it's each time dependent on the Rabbanim in charge, how they're weighing and evaluating the situation, right? How to apply it, whether to apply it. There's some who are vehemently opposed to it. Okay, but all of that is part of what. Yeah, that's the responsibility that Rabbanim carry.
Mm-hmm.
Carry a lot of responsibility. So
yeah.
Okay. Okie doke.
All right. Thanks a lot.
See you on Thursday. Take care. Okay.
All right. Okay. All right. Bye. Okay. All right, Abba. See you.